trabajos me hicieron merecedor de la medalla Fields hace 8 años, en 2010, y bueno, he obtenido múltiples premios. Es miembro de la y fue director del Instituto Henri Poincaré hasta hace poco. Y bueno, hoy viene a platicar con nosotros. Esto es un diálogo y a ver qué sale. Bueno, gracias y los dejo.
Ok. Moi, j'ai pas besoin. Ok, il y a le micro. Is it working? Everybody hear me? Yes. Thank you. Good morning, friends. It's good to be here. This is only my second trip to Mexico, but I hope that there will be many others to follow. Here I recognize some friends whom I already had quite a lot of interactions with, and it's good to see a lot of young people around. So this session is supposed to be just like a dialogue, so I will start conversation about the mathematics nowadays, recent evolutions, exchanges of views, where whatever you would like to have my opinion on, I will be glad to give. And to start the conversation, let me put on the table for you some of the trends that seem to me most remarkable or impressive or worrying in the past few decades and going on nowadays. First, let me tell about the way mathematics as a subject is evolving. We know that for the past hundreds of years, mathematics has been growing like crazy in the volume of papers published, subject addressed, number of theorems proven, etc. And this exponential growth is still here nowadays. Depending on the times in mathematics, there have been periods in which the tendency was more like specialization going on in each of the fields, and other times at which the most impressive progress was done by connections between subfields and kind of finding global views. And it is my opinion and the opinion of many people that currently we are still in a period in which progress comes a lot through connections and the reinterpretations of things which already existed. I witnessed this during my career in a rather spectacular way. And I started my career in a very focused way. Eventually, I was quite broad in my range of subjects, but it's not that I, said, okay, now I want to do this, or now I want to do this. It is that a given subject led me to many other topics because they all turned out to be connected. I started very much connected with, focused on the study of kinetic equations for gas theory, so-called Boltzmann equation, and the trend to equilibrium, how the processes of equilibration go through the effect of collisions in a gas. It turns out that one of the methods used to study this equilibration was in the field of so-called optimal transport, in which you ask what is the distance from one probability measure to another one through the difficulty, the effort that you have to make one, to rearrange one into the other. This led me to study the interface between optimal transport and, say, fluid mechanics in general, also with a geometric touch. And I was lucky enough to be part of the small group of mathematicians around 15 years ago who discovered that there is a deep link between statistical theory and entropy on one hand, the optimal transport field on the other hand, and the third field, which is the geometry. It was very well known that geometry was related to the equilibration of diffusion equations, in particular through the study of Ricci curvature bounds, and we discovered that it was also strongly related with the entropy, and we discovered new ways of characterizing geometric bounds through the use of entropy and diffusion equations and statistical mechanics and optimal transport. So it was all an issue of reinterpreting things, and there was a lot of progress that came out of there. I saw that in the library, I saw on the bookshelves among the new books, there was the recent book of Filippo Sant'Ambrogio about some topics in optimal transportation, which is part of this field. And later, the field continued to develop much more than I expected. Recently, and recently means last year, I discovered with a great surprise that one of the books that I wrote in the field of optimal transport was starting to be regularly quoted in some papers about artificial intelligence. And 3 years ago, I was myself invited in one of these conferences of artificial intelligence, or the more specialized version of it, which is called machine learning, which I was very surprised of. When I received the invitation, I gave a phone call to one of my friends who is in this field, and I asked him, why do you think that they invited me? I don't know anything of their business. And he explained and he discussed and so on, and I discovered that, in fact, my field was now part of that business. And I discussed with some experts, told me, yes, you know, optimal transport, now we use it in this machine learning thing, and there is a very important duality interpretation of adversarial learning, which is very promising, and so on. And I see that some of my colleagues whom I have known in, let's say, differential geometry, they were also writing papers about this, and I thought, wow. Now, there are these connections between domains that are even occurring in these fields that I thought were completely stranger to me. And it was not the first time. I basically discovered the theory of Ricci curvature when it was at the time when I started to work on logarithmic Sobolev inequalities. And a few days later, with some collaborators, I was suggesting a new definition of Ricci curvature bounds based on my earlier work. So it was really connections between fields that I did not think were in the realm. This kind of things is occurring more and more still. What to do in this kind of environment in which all these new connections pop out? You cannot hope to be a specialist of everything, of course. So you have to keep your eyes and ears wide open about what is going on nearby. And it doesn't prevent you from being an expert in one field or in a couple of fields, but you really have to be open because these connections can occur in many directions. Now, this is first thought, and let me continue with this. Nowadays, I was talking about connections within mathematics, but nowadays there are more and more connections and collaboration of mathematics with the rest, with enormous amounts of other problems and fields. And in particular, through the rise of elaborate algorithms, we have seen connections of mathematics with biologists, with engineers, with people in social sciences, with medical doctors, etc., etc. And more we have seen the rise of the request for such profiles as people who are expert in math, but also expert in this other direction. it's very frequent that some of the companies who are working on developing software for the future medicine, they ask, we need urgently to hire somebody who has been trained in mathematics, in algorithmic, but who also knows about the medicine. These profiles in some cultures, you can find them. In other cultures, it's very difficult. In France, it's tricky for us. But in other countries, there are these connections which are easier. I worked on these kind of problems this year as I was coordinator of a report for the government on the rise of artificial intelligence. For this work, I made trips to a number of countries also to discuss with experts there. And I was impressed by the fact that some countries manage very well to organize this relation between the fields, and for other countries, it is very tricky. But there is enormous new science to be made at these interfaces, and we have to organize for that, and that is not easy. 2 years ago, I started a working seminar joined between the Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Medicine about this, connections of medicine and mathematics. It was almost forced on me by a colleague from the Academy of Medicine. We had met in some kind of ethics council for some competition, and he told me after the meeting, he told me, we have to organize something. And I was skeptical. I thought, how are we going to make some working seminar? But he forced me, and we organized it, and it was amazing, the number and the wealth of subjects that were discussed in this seminar. Now we are editing a book with all the contributions and a lot of problems that are at the interface between algorithmics and medicine, and which have a lot of value for medical doctors. 4 years ago, in the International Conference of Mathematicians in Seoul, for the first time there was a plenary lecture about what can be called artificial intelligence, or one branch of big data. It was Emmanuel Candes who was giving the plenary lecture, and he was talking about his collaborations with medical doctors from some hospital, and explaining how the use of harmonic analysis and techniques of reconstruction of missing data he could use with medical doctors with important practical applications, like dividing by almost 10 the time that you have to spend in a device of magnetic resonance, nuclear resonance, to get the image for your surgeon to operate on. Now, that is an example in which enormous progress can be made. And it's a sign of the time that this field was addressed. Just 4 years ago, just in the last ICM in this format. Our education is not well prepared to handle this kind of problems, at least in France and in most countries, because our students usually are not taught properly about the interactive, interdisciplinary cooperation, about project development, and the dialogue is quite tricky. We have this feeling of emergency to act on this. Let me give other thoughts about the development of science, of mathematics worldwide. Mathematics have been developed all around the world in recent years, and there have been diversity of places where it is developed. But by far the most spectacular development is in Asia. And like many of my colleagues working as an editor, I have been at times frightened by the increase in the volume of publications coming from Asia, in particular China, which is kind of putting all the system into a traffic jam. Working as an editor for Journal of Functional Analysis, as editor-in-chief, I was one of the editors-in-chief. I receive all the papers for preliminary screening all the papers in, let's say, functional analysis, partial differential equations. Some weeks, irregularly, half of the submissions that I receive are from East Asia. There are some weeks in which all the publications are from Eastern Asia. And it's really putting an enormous strain on the system. When you look at the rankings internationally and how countries are behaving in terms of number of publications in science, etc., the main fact over the past decade is the rise of China to now be in second position, just behind the United States in terms of number of publications. On the other hand, at the same time as there was this enormous volume in the number of publications worldwide, the originality has not gone up at the same pace. And we see that there has been inflation in the publication, race for publishing more and more academic problems being treated. Even though we are at a time in which there are many interesting problems which occur at the interface and very original new subjects, this does not reflect so much in the publication, or let's say the increase of this is much less than the increase of over-specialized publications that take one subject and increase it, sometimes infinitesimally. It occurs at the same time as we are still fighting with finding the right 21st century business models for scientific publication. This is an area that is still in crisis and that we don't know how to handle. I don't know what will be the future about this, but it's becoming more and more difficult to judge, more and more difficult to treat fairly the young researcher in this respect, and to find the ways to favor the publication of quality rather than quantity. These are, my last thought will be about the status of mathematics within society. At the world level, people who follow the technology and people who are interested in the top politics have understood recently that mathematics is a big asset for a state and that it's a stake of global competitivity. And worldwide, there have been these studies about the importance of mathematics in the developed economies. And we have seen that the respect for mathematicians has increased everywhere, or let's say in a lot, in all countries in which leaders are interested in the global place of their country. This has also come with a few difficulties. For instance, we've seen that business here and there have developed tendencies to hire mathematicians in certain areas of mathematics, sometimes aggressively, sometimes with very high salaries, and that in some areas it is difficult to maintain the amount and the flux of mathematicians. In France, as in other countries, we feel it strongly in the field of statistics. It is a kind of irony because statistics used to be considered as a field that was not very popular and not very respected, but now they are the ones that are hired in priority by companies, and sometimes with salaries that are much higher than salaries at the university, putting an enormous strain on the field. We don't know how to address this issue because reform things at the academic level is very slow and trends are much slower to evolve than in the business world. And this is quite a challenge that we have to address. These are my thoughts for the start. I'll be glad to hear your discussion and comments and reaction. Yes, let's start here.
Here in Mexico, industry buys all its required technology outside Mexico. So scientists, when work at the industry, most of the time is for maintenance tasks.
Scientists?
Yeah. So scientists, when work at industry, most of the time is for maintenance tasks. So I have the feeling that here in Mexico, we have a bigger problem than connecting areas. I feel we don't have a bridge between academia and productivity at all. How can we tell industry to look at their scientists rather than picking the phone?
That is a great question. The contact between the science and the industry is difficult in many countries. Some countries have been very good at organizing this, others not so good. In France, it's not so good historically. We have been working on improving this, but except in some particular industrial directions, it's been not so good. It also comes in relation with issues about publicity, culture, how scientists or PhDs, etc., are regarded by the society. But one issue that we are currently facing in France very strongly about the hiring of scientists is the competition with the American, let's say, computer science industry, or more precisely, the Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., who all put a lot of research centers in France and are hiring massively from our pool of scientists. And later, the industry, even the French industry, when they want to hire experts in these areas of mathematics that are very hot nowadays, big data and whatever, they will pick up the phone, not to phone the universities, but they will phone these American giants. And now you have this irony that in some cases it will be French researchers working for French industry, but hired by the American companies, which is a way that a lot of the added value goes away from our system. It is a big problem for us. More generally, we have problems not only in there to organize the contact between the universities and the industries. At some point, when was that? Like 10 years ago, we made a massive effort on special bodies, institutions, that we call societies for acceleration of technological transfer, that would be at the interface between the university and the outside world, let's say. So the university people, when they have a project that can be part of an industrial thing, or when they want to use one of their theories for applications, they will go to this society and they would work on contract and do legal work, etc., and then do the transmission to the industry or prepare the creation of spin-offs, etc. Globally, it has been a failure. I mean, some of these societies are working well, but globally, it's disappointing. And one of the reasons being that to make it short, if you have some body that is between the industry and the university, it will also contribute actually to isolate both worlds. It will be like an extra layer that separates things. And it's a problem that should be fixed by culture and internally. So globally, it will be more important to try to mix people, that is for the industry to hire some researchers and have some research that is done inside the industry, or for the university to hire some people coming with some industrial problems and that can explain their colleagues, so that the culture can diffuse one way or the other. And we see that more and more our laboratories understand this and try to develop the in-house expertise within the lab of people that are in direct touch with the industry. It is one of the reasons why recently government announced that they would increase the facility for researchers who want to work for the industry, remain with their position in the university, but also do some work for the industry. Who wants to contribute next to the discussion? Also, don't hesitate. If there is something that I said that you don't like, you have to protest loudly. Now that I'm a politician, I am used to be, you know, that people shout at me through the internet or whatever every day. Young people priority. This guy is very young, but we will wait for the... Okay. Yes, another young people.
Well, we knew that you give some speech about the artificial intelligence in France recently. Then I don't know if you can comment about that a little bit and why is so important artificial intelligence and not so other topics like mathematics and biology or medicine or whatever.
Yes. So, indeed, government asked me to prepare this report on artificial intelligence. So, it was in fall, and the mission was supposed to go for 4 months, but actually it was 6 months, and it really was needed. I was lucky enough to do this with a great team, including one real expert researcher in artificial intelligence, who does have this experience of working both on the theory and on the applications for the industry. But also in the team, there were some experts from the engineering side, some experts from the humanities side. So 6 people working with me. And we worked on a complete tour of the question, like developments in the industry, organization of the research, consequences on the job market, problems of the ethics, impact on the environment, main sectors which have priority for the development, like health, transport, environment, defense. So we looked at all these issues and interviewed hundreds of people about all this. First, I will say that as I told you, I was working as a mathematician in a completely different area, and one day I realized that it was not so different, not so far away from my interests. And actually, artificial intelligence is a field that has expanded in many directions and branches of mathematics. Some of the keywords are a lot of probability and statistics, some stochastic processes, large dimensional linear algebra and probability and geometry in some respects. And it has led to some fascinating developments. However, for the moment, this is an area that whose theory is underdeveloped compared to the use and pragmatic exploration. The theory in which the know-how is much more important currently than the knowledge itself. And it's a theory in which there are huge discoveries to be made to explain the phenomena which are observed. One of the head of one of the top labs in Europe about AI was telling me that specialists of artificial intelligence nowadays is like alchemists from the old time, you know, looking for magical formulas to transmute the elements and so on, with a big book full of magical formulas. And where is the problem? He wrote in his big book what is the magical formula to handle this. And because you have these recipes whose success is remarkable and we don't really know how to explain. And conversely, if you want to enter through it and ask, what is the theory? Theory is surprisingly slim. If you, for instance, you want to go into neural networks, which is this very hot area, and you go in the books, you will see that basically it all stands on one mathematical formula, which is the formula of gradient flow in a large space, in a large dimensional parameter. And in spite of this, success was amazing recently and unexpected. People in the theory of algorithmics a few years ago, they were still telling you neural networks doesn't work. We've tried this for decades, it's inefficient. And now, wow, guess what? It is very efficient. Because of the increased speed of the hardware, because of the huge databases, but also because of something that we don't know. And there are huge challenges for the theoreticians in there, putting more theory in that. Now, the urgent challenges are in developing the applications because there is intense international competition about this. And because artificial intelligence is so much dependent on the use and the experiment, it's a field in which progress is made by contact between the specialties. Put the specialists of algorithmic together with the specialists of medicine is mandatory to have the development of artificial intelligence in medicine. And so on. If you want to improve the AI in the education, you need to put teams, including experts of education and experts of algorithmic and school teachers and whatever. Very interdisciplinary. Let's take the example of medicine. What is AI used for in medicine? One of the most basic applications, one of the things that everybody tries to do is automatic recognition from medical data to identify the disease, for instance. Why is it important? First, because the amount of medical data is growing like crazy. And now you have all these tests that you can make and all these images. But also enormous amounts of data coming from genetics or epigenetics. So enormous amounts of databases that you want to analyze, but that humans cannot analyze because it's so big. Second, there is potential for human mistake, which is large because of the variety of diseases. And third, in many places in the world, there are not enough medical doctors to handle the demography of the world, which is increasing. Even in developed economies, the most developed countries, the problem of medical service is becoming a real issue. Even in France, we are currently experiencing shortage of medical doctors in some parts. So in this context, if some of the recognition can be automatized, it will be important. Another field in other applications of AI will be like in automating or helping the process of treatment. Which treatment will we use? And how to follow the evolution of the disease. Take cancer. In some cases of cancer, even for the images, it's tricky to decide how the evolution is going on. And it's tricky to decide what type of treatment you should choose among the many possibilities. Another possibility is detecting possibilities of treatment by analyzing huge databases. Sometimes you find that the combination of medication gives strong effect, and the medical doctors or the biologists, they have no explanation whatsoever for this. It just comes out of the statistics because of the mystery of the biology, the medicine. Also for DNA analysis, and lot of other, and some other applications. Some companies have worked very hard already in this, and some big famous companies have their research labs. Let me give you some of the tricky issues in this. First, training issue. Very difficult to convince the trainings of medical doctors that they should adapt in these directions. And it's very difficult to put the people together and to talk to each other. Even at the level of the vocabulary, it's difficult. Another tricky issue is in the cooperation of the institutions. For developing these issues, you need, for instance, big databases, which in many cases are owned by the hospitals. And in many cases, hospitals do not want to share this data with the specialists of algorithmics. Think, okay, why should we share the data? Maybe there is some important added value, then it is ours, and we should be making the added value, not the entrepreneurs. Or in some other cases, they may sell the data, make a big deal about this, but then the people whose medical records have been used, they are not happy. How is it that our personal history, something that is very confidential and precious to us, was used by companies? So you have to work also on the ethics and on the law. You may also have problems about the publicity. For instance, in this problem of recognition of cancer, recently there was from time to time, there are these world competitions. And a couple of years ago, a French team derived from INRIA arrived first in this competition, which was about recognizing some types of cancers, breast cancers, I think. Nobody in France talked about it. One local journal made some mention about it. But when an actor like Google explains his results in the field to dozens of journalists that have been invited for this occasion, then it's in the headlines. Oh, artificial intelligence is making enormous progress in recognizing cancers. They can already do better than humans, etc., etc. So it's a scientific problem, but that you cannot disconnect from the ideas of promotion, economics, business model, and so on. Now, the role of the state is also very important in this kind of problem. In France, we have this idea that health is some kind of public good, and that the state should play a key role in organizing this. But state should not be the one developing the solutions. It may take a lot of time. It may slow down the capacity of private actors to try for solutions. But we arrived at this conclusion that it was in the role of state to impose some connection of the data from the hospitals, from the medical doctors' records, from the universities, from the administrative databases, and so on. And to make sure that this data can be open to other actors that are entitled to make some good research for developing new therapies. This is tricky, requires a lot of persuasion, requires discussion with the government also, etc. So this gives you a sample of the issues that that you have to deal with when you handle artificial intelligence. It's problem about science and algorithmics, but it's also about economics, about governance, about ethics, and so on. And it's also about a job, because nowadays already many people are wondering whether experts in reading the radiography will disappear, will be replaced by software. And people will say, no, they will not disappear, but their task will change. They will be more like integrators of analysis. They will also be more like with the contact with the patients and explanation. And they will have to work more with the integration with the team of surgeon or whatever. So it will be like going to something that is more higher level than the down-level analysis. But this thing requires experiments and requires training. And so far, it's difficult to organize the experiments and to change the training. But these are fundamental to prepare the evolution of the jobs. And this is an example in which a job which may be threatened one day is a rather high-level job. But there are many also lower-level jobs that may be in trouble or that will have to adapt. And to see how they adapt, we will need also experiments, observatories. Not easy to put in place. So the job of our mission was to make a report about this, but also to communicate about this very widely through the newspapers, through the television, regular discussions with the governments, like we saw all the ministries, the cabinets of the ministers and each of them. And with the Cabinet of Environment, we discussed about how we have to make sure that big data doesn't pose threat to the environment and how it can be used to applications about, for instance, detection of disease to help the environment, things like this, or saving the energy. But also with the Ministry of Equality between Sexes, we discussed about the fact that about fighting against discriminations and make sure that the algorithm does not reproduce sexist bias and things like this, and also how to have more women in algorithmics. But also we discussed with the Ministry of Defense and with the Ministry of Transport, etc. All ministries are concerned with this, even if they are not aware of it. And so organizing this dialogue, this awareness problem, was an important part of the mission. There.
This is a question from the live streaming public. This comes from Luis Victoria, and he says, how can we start the dialogue with the government so that scientists and science in general gain more attention?
The dialogue between the government and the science. Yes. That is a very tricky question. and it depends quite a bit on the cultures, but worldwide it has not improved so much in the past decades. In some countries, like United States of America, it has decreased very clearly. The counselor of the President of the United States used to be the most important scientific advisor in the world. Now he doesn't even exist. The position has been removed. Well, so it's an interesting evolution. Institutional response globally is rather poor. When you create a new council that is in charge of science advisor for the government, if the government doesn't take it seriously in their hearts, it will not work. For years, I have sat on a council in France that was supposed to advise the government. No impact whatsoever. It was supposed to be under the presidency of the Prime Minister, but Prime Minister never gathered the council. From time to time, Minister of Higher Education and Research did gather the council, but it was too rare and the impact was too little. On the other hand, with my personal implication in the Parliament and also the implication of some members of parliament who come from science, impact was much better. We could work on some missions and reports for the government. We could go in some, events with a double etiquette, to say. Like I go to some official visits, for some of the meetings as member of parliament, for some of the meetings as a scientist, or on TV show, it will be the same. And in this way, I can do the relation between the scientific problem and the policy problem. When I made my campaign for election, I told the people, it's important that there are some scientists in the parliament so that they can explain their colleagues, etc. And now that I'm there, I can see that it is indeed important. So this kind of, passing through people is much more efficient. In some countries, culture is good at the communication between science and government. Clearly, for instance, China has a very good connection with this. Government will organize the science and work on the good budget and make communication also on the science programs of China worldwide, etc. And many of the leaders in China, they have a scientific training, engineering, or so on. And so with these cultural issues, it works well. In Japan, the main advising body of the science for the government meets very regularly, directly under the presence of the Prime Minister, and there are public reportings about what is there. And you see here, this connection that is like habit that works well. So making things evolve then is quite tricky because cultural changes take much more time than institutional changes. And so the answer to the question is not easy. It's important that also scientists go to the public audience, and tell about how important is this or that. And it's important that as scientists, we learn to go more into the political issues. And for a long time, there was this view that, okay, scientists stay apart from the political problems. We remain pure. When we are asked an opinion, we give our scientific opinion. And that's it. And we say, okay, and we don't care about, now let the people. And now that we see that it did not work in influencing the world leader in some of the most important issues on Earth, we have to change this attitude. I am currently reading a book that is whose name is The Honest Broker, which was suggested to me by a world expert in scientific advising to governments, and that takes this kind of arguments and analyzes the various ways in which the science can position itself next to the government, and argues that in the current world we should not continue in the same attitude as staying detached, but we have to kind of take, in many cases, and it depends on this configuration, but in many cases, go in these political issues, not necessarily by saying we have to do this, but saying something like, look, there are these or that issues and directions. And society has to choose between this or that. If you do this, the consistent scientific choice is that. If you do this, then it's that, and etc. But give various scenarios in which you put the society choice next to the science issue. And also when we do communication outside, it's important that we accept to talk about things that are not in our specialty. Otherwise, people remain with the impression that, okay, these guys only know their subject, but they are not really part of the world. So we don't really need to involve them in the decision. Just from time to time, ask them a question and then make the decision for ourselves. Other question there was, okay, let's hear Alberto.
I'm very proud of mathematics. I remember fascinated by the fact that big data mining, artificial intelligence, pattern recognition changed my life. You know, the fact that I go to Google and instantly get information made me very proud of my subject. But also, on the other hand, I would like to raise the question of ethical and moral issue. What happens if all this is used by hedge funds to become millionaires in the stock market and increases the inequality in the world? So the thing that I love the most, mathematics, which I think morally is for the good of humanity. Sometimes, for instance, all these methods could be used, like Facebook, big money, could be used, for instance, to interfere in the minds of the people and change a government for the bad. I mean, I don't have a concrete example, but I think that could happen. So I think together with what you are saying, I think it should be raised the ethics and the morality of our subjects. It's an interesting question, I think, has to go together with that development.
Very good. Yes, let's hear some other questions, and then I will answer globally. I saw that our friend with the hat here also has.
Yeah. Well, I do believe that you talk about the state, let's say the paper or the part of the state in connecting areas and promoting solutions. Well, here in Mexico, I do believe that the state promotes buying the solution outside the country, since it is cheaper to do that than creating a solution locally. So in that scenario, how can we start a dialogue?
Yes, and both questions are related in the sense that it is about how to organize a society with respect to the rise of algorithms, how to make sure that it is used for the good, and how to make sure that it reinforces our society rather than other societies. First, technology, as we know, is always dual. It's neither good nor bad. It depends on what we do. And modern algorithmic has made some amazing achievements, already demonstrated amazing achievements both in the good and in the bad. And in the good, yes, our relation to information was revolutionized by algorithmics. There is no relation between information nowadays and what it was already 10 years ago. And it changes our possibilities and so on. Achievements such as good level automatic translation, automatically finding of the relevant web pages, face recognition, all these are amazing. And 10 years ago, people did not think it would be as fast. But also things like tracking, profiling have gone at amazing speed. At the beginnings of the internet, a famous cartoon by a humorist at the beginning internet was representing a dog who was surfing on the internet, and the catchphrase was, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And recently, there was a follow-up of this drawing, and you see the same dog, and now he watches at the computer and says, how did they figure out that I am a dog? Indeed, nowadays, there is possibility to know about ourselves that we did not expect and did not want to, and possibilities to manipulate us in enormous ways. And yes, if Facebook at some point wants to influence an election, yes, it can. Because it has been demonstrated. Keyword for this is Cambridge Analytica, and you can follow up all the research coming from this, and also transfer from theoretical research to applied research when it was not intended to. At some point, it was about let's do these studies in social sciences about personality, and it's a fascinating problem to understand how the personality and developing models for this and putting them into just a few parameters. You know, big common paradigm of big data is the idea that even if you have something that depends on an enormous amount of parameters, you can boil it down to just a small number of effective parameters. And in the case of personality, they use just these 5 parameters. Model is called OCEAN. And based on these 5 parameters, you have a grade out of 10 in each of these. They will know also which kind of messages you are sensitive to. If it is in an election, what kind of message you would like to see. Whether it is better to try to frighten you or to reassure you. Make sure that everybody gets the information that he or she is most sensitive to. And from the many traces that you leave on the internet, they can gather things from you. And at some point, it was so efficient that it was scaring people when they realized. Famous example is when pregnant women would receive advertisement for things about babies and so on. Like, how is it that they discover that I am pregnant? Because they have consulted it of that site and it was all recorded. And then they learned, even the companies learned how to disguise this. Put the information with other information to pretend that they did not realize that you were pregnant or whatever. It's manipulation that is done in a smarter way, etc. All this now we know it is true. And there even was an experiment in which, for the people from Facebook, they experienced these, let's say, all the users from this group, we give them this kind of news and we rearrange the order of news for the other, and then we see if they feel more depressed or less depressed. And then there was big controversy, like how dare you put the people subject to some experiment without even informing them. And this, we know, is completely possible. And by the way, it's done very routinely when it is about choosing titles of news, which is the title that the users prefer. Very easy. You send to a group 1 title. If you hesitate between 3 titles, you send 3 titles to various groups, and you see which title triggers the most amounts of clicks. And then you stick up with this title. So this goes into an increase of sensationalism, etc. And more and more fear, more and more whatever. Also, there are studies showing that manipulations globally are very efficient. Fake news, they propagate faster, and they are more resistant to attempts to fix than other kinds of news. This is posing a whole big set of problems for society as a whole. There was a book a couple of years ago by a mathematician that was like a big splash in this. Some of you know her. Her name is Cassie O'Neill. She worked as a professional mathematician. She also was a quant. She has her blue hair of protester or whatever. And she wrote this book called Weapons of Math Destruction, which is a book that really was a shock to me when I read it. It's not the only book talking about this subject, but it was the first that was really written by somebody who's an expert on it, and showing with detailed examples what can go wrong in the algorithmic. Of course, there is playing on the words because it's math, but it's also like math because it really goes at math scale. And the subtitle of the book is something like how big data and artificial intelligence threatens democracy, something like that. And she goes on analyzing chapter after chapter, which are the examples at points in which the big problems are posed either by a use which is unethical or just by clumsy use that can be very destructive also. This is a must-read because it makes you think of our responsibility in designing the algorithms. And she also does some research about what would be the process to have more transparent algorithms that can be verified, that can be checked and modified, etc. So we now have all this to think about in our responsibility of mathematicians. And it's a tricky one. There was a time at which mathematicians' ethics was very much criticized. That is when there were the big world financial crisis, 2008 or so on. And one of our respected French politicians went as far as to say that those mathematicians who devised the algorithms to help the finance were guilty of crime against humanity. And the defense of the mathematicians was to say, look, all we did was find these mathematical methods that work in some conditions, and then people used them without understanding them and made some clumsy things with them, and it was a disaster. And it is true that clumsy things were done with the methods, out of range, whatever. And in this sense, responsibility of mathematicians was not the main point. But it shows that we mathematicians were not present enough in the decision center, in the communications, in the society critical points, so to speak. And if we just say in our role of mathematicians, we will lose also this battle of the coming artificial intelligence. So that book is a great example of what we can do to make people sensitive to issues, to explain it to the politicians and to the broad audience, and also to show which are the problems and which can be the solutions. Of course, you should always talk about the solution, because if you always say it may be disaster, etc., nobody is happy to see this. But you should also address which are the big issues that are dangerous. Otherwise, people will rightly think that you are hiding some of the dirty truth. So we have to think of all this, and there is an evolution of our role as scientists. Last question, and I will be very quick because I have all these signs that we have to be quick. So I will answer very quickly. Hold on, the mic is coming.
Thank you. You were talking in your presentation that globally mathematics education lacks some skill development. So in the face of the actual panorama of mathematics, what would you recommend to the students, to us, the students, in order to surpass those deficiencies? And how can we find an equilibrium between high specialization and adaptability? Because
this is great question, great issue at all levels. First, math education, even from the very start, is in trouble worldwide. I also worked on this for the government with a report on mathematical education in France. I was very much frightened by what I saw in the process of studying. Our education has so much problems. I wrote this in a report, and then whenever I go to some country, some mathematicians tell me, oh, we read your report and the problems that you have are exactly the same as we have here in this country. It happened to me in Russia, it happened to me in Africa, everywhere. Mathematics is tricky to teach. Science are tricky to teach. And in education, it's not that there is automatic progress. Things that you discover in education sciences at some other point you forget, in the sense that it's forgotten in the training of teachers, and problems of human resources can screw up completely the good science that has been developed in teaching. But globally, we have to insist on involvement from the beginning in experiments, project making, going deep in the understanding and in the making, and not insisting too much on the number of subjects. So it would be a mistake to say, oh, nowadays there are so many important subjects, so we have to teach them a lot of various things. We have to insist on the process and on the quality and giving the keys and the clues then to increase and go on and experiencing. But that is a tricky one. For instance, at some point in France, we decided, okay, statistics is so important nowadays that we have to teach the statistics also in high school. It did not work well. Statistics is a very difficult subject. If you want to understand it in a good way, it requires maturity. By the way, some of our most famous experts in probability and statistics were against this extension. And we put it in the programs, and now the students, they just learn by heart. They don't understand what's the big principle behind it. They don't make the project that can give them an example of what can go right and wrong. Eventually, they forget everything, because if you learn formulas by heart without understanding the meaning, you forget them very, very quickly. So this is a tricky issue. I wrote this report anyway. It's called 21 Propositions for the Teaching of Mathematics. And I will still continue to work with the government on the evolution of the teaching of science. But it's a very tricky issue to find the right balance between all the issues. Cultural, political also. The fact that algorithmic has to be taught nowadays as part of the regular teaching from a very early age. Also, we have to input the new software in teaching possibilities, but for the moment, their impact is rather poor and experiments are not so well done. So it's very tricky. Good news is, nowadays, science is more important than ever in the society. And all these connections make the science teaching more challenging and more fascinating than ever. So we have opportunities to explore this if we do well. Okay, that is all, I guess. Thank you for your attention.
Bueno. Bueno, nada más paso un mensaje que parece que hay mucha gente en la Facultad de Ciencias esperando entrar al auditorio. Entonces van a transmitir la conferencia de allá aquí, si se quieren quedar a verla. ¿Ok? Y bueno, muchas gracias.